if at all possible, understand your organization and your business processes and your people as much as you can before you try and implement controls that may or may not be required. Secondly, work on the ethos of security being something done with a company in support of strategic business imperatives, as opposed to them. Overlaying security at the last moment never really works. Building it ingrained as companies grow, or building it with companies as transformations take place, is the way to do it.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Chris Denbigh-White. Chris is the Chief Security Officer at Next DLP, which is a leading provider of insider risk and data protection solutions. With a background as a former police and intelligence officer, he has built his career in system design, defense, and governance. And Chris most recently served as VP of Information Security at Deutsche Bank, and he is also an active contributor to the advisory board of the SaaS Institute, and he played a role in development of a ASC C2 exam. So Chris, welcome to our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Great to be here, Borges. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. So, Chris, I believe that we will have a thoughtful conversation on topics of risk presented by Shadow SaaS, and maybe also on a topic of more holistic security approach. But before that, could you explain us kind of your career path and what brought you to where you're right now, and what you guys at Next DLP are up to these days?
Sure, no problem at all. My career path is somewhat non-standard. So I started off many, many years ago, actually training as a minister of the church. I then went into policing, and then from policing went into intelligence. Whilst I was in intelligence, it was kind of cyber investigation and intelligence I was involved in. So it was then building, designing, and securing infrastructures to conduct that intelligence on. I then went around consultancy and into banking at Deutsche Bank, and then now I'm at Next DLP, primarily because I looked at what we do, and we're a software insider risk and data loss company, and I thought this actually looks really good. I'd actually use this, so why not join the company and help them to run the security program, which is what I do internally. So the majority of my day is spent on one side, ensuring that our internal processes and the build quality of the software that we have is correctly tested and built and deployed. So we don't do something so embarrassing as be a security company who introduces security problems to our clients. That's generally speaking a bad look for a company like ours. So we try and ensure that doesn't happen. And on the other side, standard business operations of information security. So we're a company like any other. So things like cybersecurity awareness training, deploying and managing antivirus and mail security software, and all these kind of things are under my purview and my team's remit as well. It's almost like a two-looking face things. And then occasionally, when time lets me, I get to come and speak to nice people like you, Horace, on your podcast and discuss some of the theory behind it all as well. So once again, fantastic to be here and great to be having this conversation with you.
All right, thanks. Thank you for joining our podcast, and I believe that we will have a very good conversation, and specifically, we will like to hear your opinion on the topic of Shadow SaaS. It's kind of a new term for me. Maybe you can start with explaining what is the Shadow SaaS and why it has become a growing concern for organizations.
Well, I think let's start with kind of so we're on kind of the same playing field around kind of what we mean by things. So SaaS is software as a service, generally speaking. So these are, in the simplest form, websites on the internet that provide a service that you potentially log into. And these can range from anything from Microsoft 365 all the way down to convertmypdf.com or Google Translate or all manner of different tools. Now, if we're implementing our IT and information security program in a mature fashion, we'll be doing things around the CIS controls potentially, or NIST, which one of those things is have an asset and an app inventory. So essentially know what you have inside your environment. So there will be SaaS applications that the business use, have risk assessed and have an understanding and have controls around. Yet The thing being is that the internet is designed to be very, very ease of use. And there are lots of applications on the internet, which in and of themselves may not be malicious necessarily, but they may not have the controls around them. So when we mean shadow SaaS applications, what we mean generally are applications that are provided on the internet, either maliciously or not, that do not fall under the governance of a company, or even sometimes the knowledge of them. So in themselves present a risk, because if it's unknown, then these things generally can't be controlled.
All right. Okay. So with regards to security risks, what are the primary security risks associated with the shadow SaaS, and how can this risk compromise and organizations that are in operations?
I think the main kind of risk of compromise here is around flows of data and where a company's data is going, because data is generally kind of the most valuable thing inside of companies, whether that be intellectual property data, PII data, or the secret sauce, or the herbs and spices of KFC data. Those are the things that companies want to have control of and understand where it is. So where there are controls and guardrails of where that data flows, absolutely fine. Companies can have an understanding of their risk. But the risk with shadow SaaS apps, and many of these apps are to do with data processing of some means or another, be it converting a PDF file or an Excel file to a PDF file, or translation or large language models, they involve some element of data transfer. So if these tools are being used, first and foremostly, without the knowledge of governance and IT and those people that understand security put the correct controls around them, then that's a loss of control of data, which is a risk for a business, and in some cases, a GDPR compromise for a business as well, depending on where these internet-based services are located. Imagine the situation that you're a European company that has strict rules with your customers around the data that you process for them, that it will remain within the EU under GDPR, unless you have something like an SEC for limited transfer, of course. And some of your staff are actually using a SaaS app whose processing is based in the United States. Potentially, the CISO or governance risk and compliance are unaware that as a company, this data transfer outside of the control and geographic control of the company is taking place. So that represents a significant risk that a lot of companies and a lot of businesses are experiencing, and some sadly don't necessarily realize that they're experiencing it until it's too late.
Mm-hmm. So you explained also kind of compliance and the legal implications of having this shadow SaaS impact on ability of organizations to comply with regulatory requirements. But what's about detection and management? What strategies and tools can organizations use to detect and manage shadow SaaS application within their networks?
That is a great question. I think it goes back to something that I learned many years ago when I was doing my SANS Institute cyber courses. And they always used to say, and they still do say, is to understand what normal in an environment, to understand basically what things are risky in an environment, you first need to understand what normal looks like. So I think the first step in control is visibility into what's happening. So companies need to be able to understand what people are using the internet for, what SaaS apps are in use in total, and then overlay a risk process of understanding and risk scoring and allowing or not allowing various SaaS apps inside the company. Then, obviously, the third step is to be able to have some form of alerting, or indeed, I've seen a great benefit in not just fundamentally blocking people for things, but alerting and diverting people onto a path of compliance. I remember from my time working in previous roles, some were more heavily governed than others with a heavier hand. And users who are presented with a, you must not do this, you've been blocked, but we're not going to tell you the right way to do things, generally don't make, the next choice that they make isn't necessarily a very good data security choice. It's usually pushing them even further towards shadow IT. Whereas the response of a security tooling saying, hey, you've attempted to do this, however, let me divert you onto a path of the correct way to do it. So introducing not just security blockages, but training and facilitation in the same process as well, turns security from roadblocks in business process into those bumper guardrails, a lot like when I take my children bowling. We have those bumpers out on the gutters at the side, so they win every time. And essentially, the aim is to introduce security controls and data security controls inside an environment so our businesses win all the time. And they're not necessarily impeded either by overly draconian security controls or, on the flip side, by phenomenally risky practices of people's use of Shadow SaaS apps on the internet.
All right. So you explained also some preventive measures and how they can kind of prevent the proliferation of Shadow SaaS. But let's go to our next topic, which is kind of a holistic security approach to cybersecurity. Could you, Chris, elaborate what is a holistic security approach means in the context of cybersecurity, and why organizations have to implement some kind of such approach?
That's another great question. And I think a holistic cyber approach, just by its definition in fundamental terms, is a cybersecurity and an information security approach which involves everybody. I think the words have almost been worn out around, we need everybody in the company to be part of cybersecurity. But still, my experience speaking to peers and colleagues is there's a definite culture of security being done to the business rather than with them. And I think we really need to get over that hump first and foremost, is to understand that we in security and we in information security and the GRC, we are a support function to facilitate the business to be able to conduct its business. We're there to help the business achieve, not impede the business. So I think we need to, with the things that we do that in that mindset. So that's part of the holistic approach. The second part of the holistic approach is visibility and bilateral communication. I think, again, the notion of security being done with a wider business rather than to it needs to be fundamental and core. So where we are implementing controls, where we are deliberately introducing a certain degree of friction, things like multi-factor authentication spring to mind directly. These things need to be handled very, very carefully and in a collaborative fashion with the wider business. All too often, I've had colleagues from a technical background that have said things along the lines of, oh, let's just implement multi-factor authentication. Technologically, it's quite simple. We just press this button, this button, this button. Now everybody has to register a multi-factor. And then they wonder why the business screams at them saying, I can't get into my computer. I don't understand how this works. Because we need to understand that we need to work with people. And not everybody in the business is a cybersecurity technical expert. In fact, we wouldn't want them to be, because they wouldn't then be able to be, if it's a bank, a banking expert, or a manufacturing company, a manufacturing expert. That's why we, as security, exist, to be able to do those things and to be able to have those lines of communication into the wider business.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So can you perhaps share some examples, maybe without dropping some names, but some success story or failure maybe of organizations implementing holistic security approaches effectively?
Yes. Okay. There's a great example of I'll talk about a blockage first, and I'll talk about a better way that existed. So first, we had a situation whereby there was a heavily regulated company that needed to engage with its third-party audit team quite all of the time. And as audits take place, of course, they require large amounts of data usually, and that data is usually sensitive because it refers to the controls that are in place inside of the company. So, and audits tend to have a very tight timescale to provide this information by this time limit or the service level agreement if the audit is breached, and then there are problems. So the situation occurred that the person who was in charge of collaborating with the audit basically received the request, please send this large CSV file essentially to the auditor for questions and analysis. They attempted to do this, and their security tooling said, you can't send this. It's blocked because it's sensitive. The person attempting to send this was perfectly aware, I'm totally aware that this data is sensitive. I'm allowed to do this. This is my job to do this. But they were left in a situation of actually not knowing, okay, so I've now had it identified for me what the wrong way of doing this is, but actually, how do I get on and do my job? And they were left blocked and stuck. Contrast that with a similar situation that I've heard of, where the same thing happens. The user attempts to upload, I think, attach things to an email. I think it was a CSV file. The security tooling pops up and says, hey, look, you've attached this sensitive data to an email. This isn't the best way to do this. We've protected you from yourself. We've blocked this. However, click here because there is a shared data room with this auditor where you need to upload your basic audit evidence to directly via HTTPS. It's encrypted, so do this instead. And I think therein lies the difference, in that if you're going to block people and you don't give them an alternative, you push people to things like more into shadow IT than you do into kind of embracing and finding out what the correct way to do. And we have seen that time and time again.
All right, this is interesting case. So, Chris, I would like to ask you a personal point of view. So, what is the major misconception in your field of cybersecurity that you strongly disagree with?
A major misconception, something I keep coming up again and again, is around password complexity and password rules. NIST made a change into their guidance. You know, for years and years, it was your passwords must be 8 characters long, must be complex, and what you need to do is change them every 90 days. You know, that was the rule. But actually, NIST, years ago, they did a number of things. They did some research on their guidance, and they found, and I think you do find, if you have a password kind of reset rule for every 90 days, you find that people's passwords tend to be summer 2024, spring 2024, autumn 2025, you know, for every season, or people start to reuse passwords, or forcing somebody to change a password. And 8 characters these days is way too short. So I think, you know, inside of our company, for example, we have a long password, long complex password. We use a password manager as well, which is really, really useful. Multi-factor authentication absolutely is really important. But the whole notion of kind of rotating passwords for the sake of it, I think NIST recommends that certainly that, you know, if you believe a password to be compromised, then by all means change that password. But if it is suitably long, complex, and behind multi-factor authentication, then actually the research has shown that rotating passwords unnecessarily introduces greater risk than not doing. So that's one thing I find, you know, a strange quirk, that some people haven't necessarily kind of updated their guidance and are still on 8-character passwords, no multi-factor, and literally changing them all the time, which introduces admin friction and actually doesn't improve security.
All right, awesome. This is interesting point of view. Yeah, I never thought about it.
Yeah. If I could point out one more slightly, actually, that springs to mind is sometimes people's assumption that they are not at risk of cyber compromise, external cyber compromise specifically, because they're not that interesting to attackers. And I think in the days of automated attacks and automated scans of the internet, generally speaking, the attackers, you know, there are targeted attacks, yes, there are, but to assume a level of safety based on the fact that you think that you're not of interest to someone, I think is definitely faulty logic. And I do see that a lot as well. You know, we don't really need to invest in perimeter security because, you know, who would want to attack us? Courageous thinking, shall we say, in quotation marks, not in quotation marks, faulty logic, if you ask me.
Yeah, so specifically for startups, I think, why do I need this? Because I am so small, nobody is interested about me. But then you end up growing, and you accumulate customers and partners, and your database become a kind of interesting target for potential fraudsters and criminals, right?
Yes, and even if it isn't an interesting target, a lot of these attacks are automated entirely. Look at the SolarWinds attack. That covered a large amount of SolarWinds customers, whether it was targeted against SolarWinds and certain SolarWinds customers, but a majority of collateral damage took place. And collateral damage does take place in kind of things crawling the internet to determine, can I compromise this, to ransomware this, to mess with this, to exfiltrate data. You know, if there is something that is able to be compromised that is directly connected to the internet, generally speaking, they don't check who you are first before these crawlers then attempt to do something like kind of enslave people into an RDP botnet or something like that. So to assume, again, you know, that you're of no interest being of interest is secondary to being at risk, I think. And we need to act and realize that the exposure is there, whether or not we think as a company we're interesting or not.
All right. Let's discuss a little bit the topic of mitigating insider risks. Because they pose a significant risk to organization. What are some common strategies for identifying and preventing insider threats?
I think there's some old school ones of there's kind of identifying triggering events. I think there's a balance to be struck here in insider risk mitigation. You know, especially in Europe, we can't, either by law or by ethics, be overly intrusive and creepy in our monitoring of our staff. You know, we hire staff, we should generally be able to trust them. So having a CCTV camera or the cyber equivalent on them literally all of the time and watching everything that they do and not trusting them. Certainly in certain countries like Germany, you're not allowed to do that. And there's a balance to be struck in relation to that. So that needs to be thought about first. But I think combating insider threats starts with pre-employment checks and with maintaining a good relationship with your staff. Then there are technical things. There are triggering events that you can say that would elevate insider risk. And then with those triggering events, of course, there are technical, technical things you can do. But I think in a well-managed company, in a well-managed information security program, these insider risk controls are very similar to your data loss prevention controls. Because if you're implementing guardrails and understanding what normal looks like inside of your company, it's like a very still pond with life rafts. You know, so if somebody is inside the lake or inside the pond and they're drowning and thrashing around, that becomes all the more visible. Whether that be a malicious insider or a accidental insider, because these guardrails and that visibility is already there, companies are in a much better position to be able to identify and respond. But I think more often than not, companies want an easy button. You know, they don't understand their business processes. They don't understand what normal looks like. And then they expect to kind of look into their wider company and all of a sudden be able to pick out insider risks left, right, and center, when actually the process of understanding data flows, there are technologies that can help with this, of course, is the first step in understanding deviations from norms, and therein lies insider risk identification.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So if we summarize our interview for those who are listening in, would like to walk away with some major takeaways, a few or maybe one or two takeaways, what would it be?
I think firstly, if at all possible, understand your organization and your business processes and your people as much as you can before you try and implement controls that may or may not be required. Secondly, work on the ethos of security being something done with a company in support of strategic business imperatives, as opposed to them. Overlaying security at the last moment never really works. Building it ingrained as companies grow, or building it with companies as transformations take place, is the way to do it. And for that, we need to talk to people. And sometimes that's in person, over Zoom calls or in person. You know, firing emails, I think people can lose a certain degree of their humanity in that respect. And finally, I think it's, as security leaders, it is our role and our responsibility, and in certain degrees our privilege, to be able to provide a safe space for our businesses to operate. That's what we're there for. We're not there to be the killjoys that block stuff. We're there to provide a place where business can take place, and there are those guardrails in place to protect the business from itself, protect the business from attacks from outside as well. But most of all, to do that in as little friction as possible, because business's job is to conduct their line of business, not to prop up a security function. We're there, we're very much a support function, and I think a lot of security leaders need to remember that.
Fantastic. So that's all my questions. Perhaps if I forgot to ask you something that you feel important to our audience, please go ahead.
No, absolutely not. Certainly, if you want to kind of understand some more about my opinions in relation to information security, I'm quite easily findable on the internet, as is the company I work for, of course. But outside of that, I think we have covered phenomenally large amount of topics today for us. It's been a genuine pleasure to chat to you.
All right, fantastic, Chris. Thank you for your time today, and I wish you great success in your job. And maybe in the future we can do another podcast interview with your guys to understand what is the market on the future, maybe future trends and conditions on the market.
Certainly sounds good to me, Roy. It's always a pleasure.
All right, bye-bye.